There was only one name anyone cared about: Bumpy Johnson. It was an August afternoon in 1958. Yard time had just begun when the guard shift changed. That was the moment 5 officers decided it was time to make an example out of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. They believed the old man needed to be reminded who was in charge. Bumpy was 53 years old then. He had already spent 6 years inside, serving a long sentence for drug charges. 6 years of the same harsh routine: cold cells, isolation, constant pressure from guards who treated prisoners as something less than human. Time had taken a toll on his body, but not his mind. His thinking stayed sharp. His posture stayed proud. His self-respect never cracked. And that, more than anything, irritated the officers watching him. They couldn't stand that he carried himself with dignity. In their view, inmates were meant to be broken down, especially those who refused to look small or afraid. But Bumpy walked the yard with his head up, calm, steady, unshaken. The officers had been watching him for weeks. They saw how other prisoners, young and old, from every background, showed him quiet respect. It didn't matter that he was locked up. His presence still carried weight. They knew his past. He wasn't just any inmate. He was a legendary figure from Harlem, a man who had survived battles with powerful criminals and earned respect from people far above his station. That history made the officers angry. They didn't like that bars hadn't taken his confidence. They didn't like the way he met their eyes without fear. To them, it looked like defiance. A few days earlier, one of the officers had made the plan clear. They would embarrass him in public, push him until he cracked, make sure every man in the yard understood who really ran the place. If Bumpy broke, it would send a message. At 2:47 in the afternoon, the 5 guards started walking toward him. Bumpy stood near the north wall with 2 other inmates. They were talking quietly about books, strategy, things that kept the mind active. For him, thinking was survival. Around them, more than 100 men filled the yard, lifting weights, walking laps, passing time. But heads began to turn. People noticed the guards moving together with purpose. The mood changed. Everyone sensed what was coming. One officer reached Bumpy first and stepped directly into his space, close enough to provoke a reaction. His tone was sharp, commanding. He ordered Bumpy to move. There was no rule behind it, no official reason. It was meant to test submission. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult anyone. He simply stated the truth. There was no rule that said he had to move. He had the right to stand where he was. The yard went silent. Even the men beside him tensed, ready to defend him if needed. But Bumpy lifted his hand and stopped them. This wasn't their fight. The officer didn't like that response. Being challenged, even calmly, was something he couldn't accept. He shouted again, louder this time, trying to turn the moment into a spectacle. He wanted fear. He wanted obedience. Bumpy stayed still. He didn't threaten. He didn't plead. He simply stood his ground. That was enough to turn tension into anger. The officer stepped closer, voice shaken with rage. He demanded compliance, not because of rules, but because he expected it. Bumpy looked at him steadily. There was no panic in his eyes, no submission either, just presence. A man refusing to give up his dignity. That refusal hit harder than any insult. The officer shoved him with both hands, driving him back into the wall. For a brief second, Bumpy lost balance. His age showed, but only for a moment. He caught himself, straightened his jacket, and stepped right back to where he had been standing. Then he smiled. Not a happy smile, not a mocking one. It was calm, controlled, almost knowing. That expression said everything without a single word. It said, "You can push my body, but you don't own my spirit." The yard held its breath. The officer saw the smile and lost control.
This wasn't about authority anymore. It was personal. He leaned in and promised consequences, loudly, publicly, making sure everyone heard. He wanted to erase that calm, that confidence. And then, without warning, he struck. The blow landed hard and fast, catching Bumpy off guard. His head snapped to the side as pain followed instantly. Blood appeared where skin had split. The yard erupted in shock. But even then, Bumpy didn't fall. He stayed upright. Because for him, this moment was never about winning a fight. It was about refusing to be reduced. And every man watching understood exactly what.
His pride was strictly business. He understood something important. He might have lost a moment, but he didn't lose who he was. That truth gave him enough fuel to survive weeks in solitary, weeks that would have crushed men who only measure life by bruises. Days 31 to 60, the mind gets sharper. By the 5th and 6th week, Bumpy had adjusted to the silence. The darkness that broke other men started to feel like a private space, quiet enough to think clearly without anyone watching him. In that quiet, he started planning long-term. He counted the years he still had left, assuming he stayed out of trouble. He pictured walking free again, back to the life he once ran, back to the streets and the people he knew, back to rebuilding what time had damaged. He asked himself hard questions. What would be waiting for him outside? Who was still loyal? What had changed while he was gone? What needed fixing first? Those thoughts kept him focused on the future instead of the cold walls around him. He also thought about the officers who attacked him. A younger version of himself might have spent every hour dreaming of payback, but the older, smarter version knew revenge inside prison was costly business. To him, those men weren't worth the risk. They had already shown what they were, people who needed a group and weapons to overpower one older man, and even then they couldn't get what they truly wanted, his surrender. That was their real failure. Days 31 to 90, preparing for the return. The final month wasn't just waiting, it was preparation. Bumpy knew that how he walked out would send a message. If he returned looking shaken, confused, or defeated, then the system would have won. But if he came out steady and clear-minded, it would prove the opposite, that solitary didn't take his identity. So he trained for the comeback. He rebuilt strength the best he could in a small space. He practiced speaking again, making sure his voice sounded firm, not weak. He replayed what he would say when he returned, words that would show the yard he was still himself. On day 90, November 12, 1958, a guard opened the door early and told him it was over. Bumpy stepped out and let his eyes adjust. After 3 months of near total isolation, he walked like a man who had nothing to apologize for. When he entered the dining hall, the room went quiet. Everyone looked up. Hundreds of men watched him, trying to read the answer to one question. Did the darkness change him? The signs of what happened were still visible. His face carried marks that time wouldn't fully erase. His movement was a little stiff, but his eyes were steady, clear, focused. No fear, no confusion, no cracks. He picked up his tray and scanned the room like a man choosing more than a seat. Where he sat would be a statement. He walked straight to the table where Marcus Williams was sitting with a few men who had been close to him before. Bumpy placed the tray down and sat like he belonged there, because he did. Then, calmly, he broke 3 months of silence. "Gentlemen, I trust my absence didn't stop the conversation. Before I was delayed, we were discussing the election. Shall we continue?" The words were measured and sharp. It wasn't just what he said, it was the fact that he remembered exactly where the discussion had paused months earlier. Marcus smiled. "Good to have you back, Bumpy. We were still on that topic. What's your read?" And just like that, they talked politics over breakfast like nothing had changed. The yard noticed. That calm conversation wasn't small talk, it was a signal. Bumpy Johnson returned with his mind intact and his respect untouched. Part 2. Lesson, Guard's Reaction, Legacy, Epilogue. Later, when yard time came, Bumpy walked to the exact spot where the confrontation had happened months earlier. Men gathered close, hungry for answers. One of them finally asked what everyone was thinking. How did you survive 3 months in solitary and come back like this? Most men don't. Bumpy paused, then gave them the truth, simple and direct. The dark can't break you if you know who you are. Most people think they're only their body, their name, or what others say about them, but those things can be taken. What matters is what's inside, your mind, your principles, your self-respect. That's what they couldn't touch. They listened like students, because he wasn't just telling a story, he was giving them a method for survival, inside prison and outside it. Meanwhile, the officers who attacked him had to watch his return with frustration. They tried to bury him, they tried to label him, they tried to isolate him until he changed, and still he walked back in like he owned himself. A few days later, Sullivan passed him in a hallway. Their eyes met. Sullivan's anger was still there, but it was powerless now. Bumpy's expression said everything without words. You tried. I'm still here. Sullivan looked away first. Later, someone asked Sullivan if he wanted to push things again. Sullivan shut it down. Leave him alone, he said. We already tried, and he didn't fold. That admission was bigger than any punch, because it meant the truth had become clear. Some men can be controlled physically, but they can't be owned. And the story spread. Men told it to new prisoners. Men told it during transfers. Men carried it far beyond Alcatraz. Not as a story about fighting, but as a story about identity. The lesson became simple. You can hurt a person's body. You can isolate them. You can try to shame them, but you can't take their dignity unless they hand it over. Years later, after leaving Alcatraz, Bumpy spoke about it to people close to him. He said the entire attack had one goal, to force him to accept being less, to make him beg, to agree even silently that he didn't deserve pride. But he refused. He explained it like business. Real power isn't about force. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to lower it for anyone. And that's why the story outlived the prison. Because it wasn't only about him. It was about what any person can hold on to, even when everything else is taken. Epilogue. After that incident, he served more time, but the message was out. Going after him again would only make the system look weaker. When he finally walked free in 1963, he carried scars that never fully disappeared, but he also carried something more valuable than comfort, proof. Proof that the hardest place in the country tried to crush him and failed. And that proof became his legacy. Dignity is an inside job. If you know who you are, you can endure what others can't. And that strength lasts longer than any bruise, any cell, any...
His pride stayed strictly professional. Bumpy understood something most men never learn. You can lose a moment and still win the war. Holding his head high mattered more than any bruise. That belief carried him through weeks in solitary, weeks that would have broken men who only counted damage on their bodies. Days 31 to 60, the mind hardens. By the 5th and 6th week, Bumpy adjusted to the silence. What crushed others became his workspace. The darkness turned into privacy. No noise, no watching eyes, no need to perform for anyone. In that quiet, he started planning. He counted the years he still had left, about 7, assuming things stayed steady. 7 years until he walked free again, back to Harlem, back to the life he once ran. He thought about what would still be standing when he returned, what would need rebuilding, who could still be trusted, what mistakes he wouldn't repeat. Those questions filled the hours and kept his focus forward instead of on the cold floor beneath him. He also thought about the officers who attacked him. A younger version of himself might have spent every day planning payback, but experience taught him better. Revenge was bad business. Those men weren't worth the risk. They had already revealed the truth about themselves. It took a group, tools, and numbers to overpower one older man, and even then, they didn't get what they wanted. They failed to break him. That knowledge was their punishment. Days 61 to 90, preparing the return. The final month wasn't about surviving, it was about preparation. Bumpy knew the way he walked out would tell the entire prison everything it needed to know. If he came back shaken or confused, the system would have won. But if he returned steady and sharp, it would prove the opposite, that nothing essential had been taken from him. So he prepared. He rebuilt strength as best he could. He practiced speaking, keeping his voice calm and firm. He rehearsed his first words back, making sure they would land with weight. On November 12, 1958, the door finally opened. After 90 days in near total isolation, Bumpy stepped out calmly, adjusting to the light. The darkness hadn't taken his stride. When he entered the dining hall, the noise faded. Every eye locked on him. The marks of what happened were still there. His face carried permanent reminders. His movement wasn't perfect, but his eyes were steady, clear, focused. No fear, no confusion. He picked up his tray and scanned the room. Where he sat would be a message. Sitting alone would suggest isolation. Sitting with his people would say everything continued as before. He walked straight to the table where Marcus Williams sat with men who had shared business with him before. Bumpy set down his tray and sat without hesitation. Then he spoke, breaking 3 months of silence. "Gentlemen, I trust my absence didn't end the discussion. We were talking about the election before I was delayed. Shall we continue?" The words were calm and precise. More importantly, he remembered exactly where the conversation had stopped. Marcus smiled. "Good to have you back, Bumpy. We were still on that topic. What's your take?" They talked politics over breakfast, quietly, intelligently. The yard understood what that meant. Johnson had returned with his mind intact and his standing untouched. The lesson. Later, during yard time, men gathered around him, searching for answers. One finally asked, "How did you survive 90 days in solitary and come back like nothing happened?" Bumpy answered carefully. "The dark can't break you if you know who you are. Most people think they are their body, their reputation, or what others think of them. Those things can be taken. What matters is what's inside, your mind, your principles, your self-respect. That's what no one can touch." The men listened closely. He wasn't just telling a story, he was teaching.
It was just after 2 a.m. on Thursday, June 15th, 1950, when the phone rang. There was only one voice that mattered on the other end. Big Mark Washington. In over a decade of working together, he had only called at that hour 3 times. Every time, it meant something had gone terribly wrong. His words were short and heavy. "Boss, it's May. Get to Harlem Hospital. She's alive, but it's bad." Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was 44 years old at the time. He had been married to Mamie Johnson for just over a year. She was his wife, his calm, and the one part of his life untouched by the business that ruled Harlem. The drive to the hospital took less than half a minute. No sirens, no conversation, just silence. The kind of silence that tells you a line has been crossed. Bumpy already knew one thing for certain.
Someone had harmed his wife, and whoever was responsible had made a mistake that would echo across New York for years. Inside the emergency ward, everything moved fast. Doctors and nurses surrounded Mamie, working with urgency and focus. She was unconscious, injured badly enough that survival was not guaranteed. A senior doctor explained the truth plainly. The next 72 hours would decide everything. If she held on, there would still be long surgeries ahead and an uncertain recovery. Bumpy stood beside her bed, holding her hand while the staff worked. He leaned close and spoke softly, promising he was there and that what had been done would not go unanswered. Those nearby felt it immediately. His voice was calm but final. Out in the hallway, his people were already gathering. Big Mark Washington, Raymond Carter, and Sam Chun had begun putting pieces together. A taxi driver had found Mamie in the street and rushed her straight to the hospital. He brought with him torn clothing and evidence that made one thing clear: this was no accident. Photos were taken, leads were identified, and a quiet search began across the city. Word spread quickly through the crew. This was deliberate, and it was meant as a message. But it had backfired. Anyone who truly understood Bumpy Johnson knew what this meant. He wasn't reacting with rage. He was thinking clearly. And that made what came next far more dangerous. Part 2. The decision that shut down Harlem for years. While doctors worked to save Mamie, Bumpy called his inner circle together inside the hospital. No one argued, no one delayed. The meeting was brief, focused, and serious. Photos were placed on the table, details were shared, timelines were mapped. This wasn't emotional revenge, it was a calculated response. Based on what they knew, all signs pointed to one group, an organization that had been trying for months to force their way into Harlem. They wanted a share of the money, control over territory, and submission. Bumpy had already told them no, firmly. He had made it clear that Harlem was not something to be taken by threats. It had been earned through years of struggle, alliances, and sacrifice. That refusal had not been forgotten. Street sources confirmed that a meeting had taken place just hours before Mamie was found. Vehicles were identified, names surfaced, patterns matched past incidents. This was not random violence. It was a warning meant to break him. Instead, it unified his entire operation. Orders were given quietly. Every move was deliberate. Information flowed from all directions. The focus was simple: identify everyone involved and make sure this never happened to anyone. Meanwhile, Mamie remained in surgery for hours. Doctors worked carefully to stop internal injuries and stabilize her condition. When it was over, she was alive, but still in danger. Bumpy stayed close, never leaving the building. What followed over the next 2 days became legend in Harlem, not because of chaos or public displays, but because of precision. The group responsible vanished from the neighborhood. Their operations collapsed. Their influence ended. And for decades afterwards, no one made the same mistake again. Because one lesson was made painfully clear: there are lines you do not cross. And